Hello, hello, good afternoon. Wow. So I was a little concerned about what size audience we would have today with the weather being so nice, but obviously we're a village that would much rather be entertained and informed than walk around in the sunshine. So I thank you all for coming. It's much appreciated. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Curator's Talk, your Society's second program in our 2015 exhibit series, Moo, and I've been reminded that I'm supposed to give the secret handshake each time I do that, which is Moo. Moo, then and now, a history of dairy farming in Cornwall. Our thanks and appreciation for your support during the exhibit opening when we had nearly 100 people in attendance. And I seem to repeat this so many times we get together, but what you guys give to us as support for the Historical Society in Cornwall is so unique. The historical societies in the villages around us, they're thrilled to get 25, 30 people for a program. And we average anywhere between 75 and 100 people. And it's just wonderful, and it's all due to you, and we thank you so very much. The program following today's will be on Saturday, July 25th, under the village tent that we're going to pitch next to the barn of Jonathan and Constance Old, down at the end of Pine Street. This gives us a appropriately fitting view, since it looks out over what was Colesfoot Valley Dairy Farms. And the cattle down there is the original breed of cattle that were introduced to Cornwall so many years ago. And it's going to be something that's going to be addressed to families. It's called Cheese Please, everything you can make from milk. And Stu Leonard's down in Norwalk is sponsoring us, and we're going to have the kids making butter and making icing and frosting for cupcakes. We're going to have a band there, so it'll be a good time, and that'll be on Saturday, July 25th. We're going to have there a steam-powered ice cream maker, and Joe Bryan, who's a master cabinet maker that I think a lot of you know around here. He's putting on a special program for 20 kids, and they're going to be able to make really nifty wooden milking stools that they can each take home. And so if you know any kids who have not signed up, please have them get in touch with Rachel through the Historical Society's phone number or website to sign up for that workshop. After today's program, please do join us for a short walk down to the Historical Society, which is air conditioned, and we have refreshments there, we have cookies, we have cold things to drink. And you'll be able to look at the exhibit from the perspective of hearing today what it's really all about. Your Historical Society is indeed fortunate to have Rachel Guest as our curator. Under her direction, the Cornwall Historical Society has won a series of both state and national awards and is the envy of so many historical associations in Litchfield County and the state. Structuring exhibits and programs that elegantly tell the stories of Cornwall and its people, organizing grants and running our wonderful website, Rachel, with her nearly 20 years of museum experience, has led the Society to a level of excellence and professionalism seldomly seen in a community our size. Note, though, that all of us involved in the organization are well aware and very appreciative of your support and input, attendance, and funding. It's the people here that make all of this possible. Please do welcome Rachel Guest, the curator and executive director of the Cornwall Historical Society. Okay.
Thank you. Okay. Butter, cheese, and milk. There were many surprises during my work on this project. Obviously, I had some idea that dairy farming was important to Cornwall's history, since I knew there'd be enough material to justify an exhibit. But I had no idea just how big an industry it was until I started looking at the numbers. Thousands of gallons of milk, thousands of pounds of butter, and thousands of pounds of cheese, and more than 100 dairy farms throughout its history. So first, a little context. And everything is in black and white today, because this is, the history. Butter in the upper portion of the screen, cheese in the lower portion of the screen. In 1860, the year before the Civil War started, Cornwall's farmers produced nearly 71,000 pounds of butter and nearly 279,000 pounds of cheese for commercial sale. That's in 1 year. The cheese was similar to cheddar cheese, like what's on the screen. Before the arrival of the railroad in the 1840s, Cornwall's farmers sold their dairy products locally to merchants and individuals, and then some also supplied Goshen's pineapple cheese factory. And this is an advertisement for said pineapple cheese. Pineapple cheese does not involve any real pineapples. It was, in fact, a European invention, and the Goshen Company here, just down the road, was the main U.S. producer for many decades. It was one of those food phenomenon. It was a fad that caught on, and everyone needed to have pineapple cheese. The cheese is formed in a net, and as it solidifies in that net, it creates a shape that is reminiscent of a pineapple, which is why it's called pineapple cheese. The cheese itself is more like a cheddar cheese. Another big surprise for me, milk was not a significant product for a very long time. It was something that, of course, was being produced by the cows. It's where the butter and cheese come from. But it was not being sold as a consumer product. We take it for granted today that milk is a consumer product, something to be found in every kitchen, poured over cereal, added to coffee or tea, or drunk straight out of a glass. But this use of cow's milk is a relatively new concept. Milk was used to make cheese. The cream from the top of the milk was valued for its use in making butter. After the cream was skimmed off the top, the remaining skimmed milk, which is where that phrase comes from, was used to feed pigs, for example, if you had pigs on your farm, and it was something that was so not valued. The valuable part was the cream, which you used to make other things. So simply put, milk was not a common beverage. Other than water, cider was probably the most common beverage during the 1700s and early 1800s. And of course, hard cider, not just apple juice. Milk would be given to infants if there was no breast milk available, but it wasn't a staple the way it is today. Things changed in the 1840s. Sylvester Graham here had nothing to do with dairy, but he's an example of what was happening. During the 1840s, health fads swept the nation. Sylvester Graham, inventor of the graham cracker, advocated a vegetarian diet of whole grains and fresh fruits and vegetables during this period. And his followers were called Grahamites, and he made promises that if you followed his way of living, you could live to be 100. And then he died in his 50s. But the public was embracing new ideas about how food impacted their health. Remembering that this is a new concept. We today know so much about how what we eat affects our bodies. And in the 1840s, this was kind of a new thing. Health advocates starting in the 1840s, pushed the concept of pure milk as an ideal food. And as such, the demand for milk as a beverage started to increase. This is the title page of, my pages are out of order. Here we go. Title page of something called Essay on Milk as an Article of Human Sustenance from 1842. Written by a social reformer named Robert Hartley in New York. And he was a major advocate of the idea of milk as an ideal food. Hartley later became concerned about something called swill milk being sold in New York City. Milk bought in the city was typically diluted with water and then beefed up with flour. So, for example, in 1853, an estimated 90,000 quarts of milk were delivered to the city's retailers from the surrounding countryside. Those 90,000 quarts of milk were somehow converted into 120,000 quarts of milk. The problem was not easily solved. 2 decades later, it continued to be an issue. In 1872, one of Cornwall's dairy farmers, Titus Hart, complained that the New York City dealers were using water to increase the amount of milk they sold by 30%. So coming back to Cornwall, it's the West Cornwall station seen from River Road. So the train tracks are to the right. The arrival of the railroad had a major impact on the dairy industry all up and down the Housatonic Valley. In 1842, the Housatonic Railroad reached Cornwall. Stations were built at Cornwall Bridge in West Cornwall, making it easy for the Cornwall farmers to ship butter and cheese to merchants in Bridgeport and New York City. There's the Cornwall Bridge station. Farmers took their butter, cheese, and milk to the stations every day, shipping their products to merchants in the cities. I had sort of assumed that, they'd be shipping to New York City because there still is that connection where everyone wants to go to New York City. But Bridgeport was a major receiver of the Cornwall shipments. So in 1845, 3 years after the railroad arrives, Cornwall farmers produced nearly 40,000 pounds of butter and nearly 177,000 pounds of cheese. 15 years later, in 1860, those numbers had nearly doubled because their market had expanded thanks to the railroad. So in 1860, they're producing almost 71,000 pounds of butter and 279,000 pounds of cheese. Now, up till 1860, there are no records about how much milk was being produced because it simply wasn't being produced for people to drink on any scale that was worth mentioning. But by the 1870s, the demand for milk dominated the market, and production of butter and cheese was reduced to a much smaller scale. So we see this transition. In the 1840s, you start seeing health advocates push for people to drink milk. And by the 1870s, people are drinking gallons and gallons of milk. Here we've got a cart carrying, there's milk cans on the cart. This is in West Cornwall in the 1880s. From the 1870s through about the 1920s, milk cans appear in countless photographs taken in Cornwall. There are several images of milk being transported by cart, either to the train station or to customers. And here's a milk pickup at the Pratt Farm. The driver, incidentally, is holding a cat on his lap. Just as the milk cans appear throughout photos of Cornwall, the cats appear throughout photos of farms. Here's another shot. This is a Sandman Farm. The photograph is really about sawing wood, building up that wood pile. But sure enough, in the foreground, there are the milk cans. And a great shot of a little boy on the Rogers farm with milk cans. It really is sort of a ubiquitous image in all of these Cornwall photographs. There just were milk cans everywhere. And cats. Just flip my pages around here. Cats, I should mention, as some of you probably understand, cats were not kept as pets on the farm the way you think of cats as pets today. They were on the farm to work. They had a job to do. They were there to keep the rodents from eating the grain and the silage. So that is something that is really an important part of the sort of the biology of a farm, that there are all these sort of fringe players like the cats who are there to help maintain things. And of course, who can resist a kitten? a view of West Cornwall in 1870. So in 1870, there were 148 farms in Cornwall, of which 142 farms had at least one milk cow. 69 Cornwall farms had 10 or more dairy cows. Theodore Gold had the largest operation with 50 cows. So this is, 1870, this is when milk is really becoming the big product. But butter and cheese are continuing on a lot of the smaller farms as the traditional product. So for example, the only woman listed on the 1870 census as a Cornwall farmer, Mrs. Laura Fox, who was an elderly widow, had a farm with 6 milk cows, producing 150 pounds of butter and 500 pounds of cheese that year. In 1870, Cornwall's farmers reported annual sales of almost 38,000 pounds of butter, 60,000 pounds of cheese, so those numbers are down drastically from 10 years earlier, and just under 300,000 gallons of milk. So in the span of 10 years, you go from milk not even being recorded as a farm product to 300,000 gallons being produced in Cornwall. Production of butter and cheese was being reduced because selling raw milk was a lot less work. There was no processing, there was no labor other than actually gathering up the milk, which is what you would have been doing anyway. The Housatonic Valley Milk Association formed in 1868 because there were so many milk producers. And at one of the meetings, one of Cornwall's dairy farmers, Nathan Hart, reported that his profits had more than doubled when he switched from selling butter and cheese to selling milk. The milk train, the first milk train in the nation began running on the Housatonic Railroad in October of 1867, shipping milk from farms in Litchfield County, Berkshire County, to New York City during the coolest hours of the day. At first, the West Cornwall station shipped only 4 cans of milk a day on the milk train. So that's 1867. 3 years later, that station was shipping more than 25,000 cans a year and was the largest supplier on the entire railroad line. So it's not just that this was big in Cornwall. Cornwall was big along the entire Housatonic Railroad line. This is also in the exhibit where you might be able to get a better look at it, this little cartoon from the 1800s. With the increase of milk being drunk, there was an increase of health-related problems. During the 1800s, all milk being drunk was basically raw milk. By the 1840s, reformers, even as they're pushing people to drink more milk, reformers had started making the connection between infant mortality rates and feeding cow's milk to children. By the 1880s, it was established that raw milk could carry diseases including tuberculosis, typhoid, streptococcus, and dysentery. Pediatricians recommended heating milk on the stove before giving it to infants, believing this would be enough to kill any germs in the milk, but this soon proved inaccurate. You could not get the milk to a high enough temperature that way. So following several years of debate over the best method for killing all germs in milk, the New York City Health Department declared in 1912 that all milk sold had to be pasteurized, which means cooking it, heating it up to a high enough temperature to kill any of the bacteria. Cooked milk instead of raw milk. 2 years later, half of all the milk sold in New York City was pasteurized. By 1917, an estimated 95% of all milk sold in New York City was pasteurized. This cartoon illustrates dirty milk and clean milk. And the column on the left shows all of the stages of milk going from the cow to the infant in which terrible things can happen. So in fact, the top illustration shows a farmer milking the cow, and the cow is covered in manure, and there's just manure everywhere, and it's really filthy and nasty. And then the milk cans are waiting at the platform of the station, and there's a hobo who's spitting into one of the cans of milk. And then when the mother is buying the milk from the grocery store, there's just filth everywhere. It's not a clean facility. It's disgusting and germ-ridden and all over the place. She takes it home, and her home is a disaster and a mess and filthy. And the moral of the story is that her infant, I'm pretty sure, is dead in the last image. It's emaciated and starved. Whereas clean milk, where you have a clean dairy, no manure in sight while the cows are being milked, you are using glass bottles, sealed bottles, to ship the milk. The mother is buying the milk from a refrigerator, so keeping it cool. Keeps it chilled at home, and then at the end, her baby is happy and healthy and weighs plenty. It's something that, it really was a concern. We have a much better level of hygiene than people did in the late 1800s. Our concept of the importance of cleanliness is remarkably different. We understand bacteria, we understand germs, we know that it's important to keep things clean, we know it's important to keep our food cold. And these were things that people just simply did not understand. Evaporated milk was introduced during the 1850s as a solution to illnesses caused by drinking raw milk, but it did not become a real success until the Civil War, when it was a staple for the Civil War soldiers. At home, however, regular milk continued to be preferred for drinking. Cornwall dairy farmers, as some of you may recall, supplied milk to Borden's factory in Canaan during the early 1900s. Back in West Cornwall, about 1870, this is the Pratt Foster team outside Pratt Foster's store right on the railroad line. There was more to Cornwall's dairy industry than farming. Several successful merchants started their careers selling Cornwall dairy products. Russell Pratt and Stephen Foster went into business in 1841, right as the railroad was being built. They knew to take advantage of this new opportunity. Their store, Pratt & Foster, was ideally suited to take advantage of the new railroad line. Farmers in Cornwall and Goshen contracted with them to ship the butter and cheese to the New York markets, to the Bridgeport market, and so on. In 1858, for example, Pratt & Foster sent 60,000 pounds of butter and 750,000 pounds of cheese to New York from the West Cornwall train station. The company also sold feed to the farmers, grinding it in a mill at West Cornwall. Pratt put his expertise in the market to advise local farmers on preparing their products for sale, how much to price their products based on the quality, and even how much cheese to expect per cow. Pratt was also familiar with markets beyond New York City, at one time noting that white cheese was preferred in the southern states, while orange cheese was preferred in the West Indies, which is very suggestive of how extensive the market really was. Pratt & Foster continued operation until the early 1870s. For many years, their success placed them at the head of commerce in West Cornwall. George Spencer Hart. This illustration is actually from a book called Notable New Yorkers, published in 1899. George Hart grew up on the family farm in Cornwall, but he didn't have the physical strength or stamina to be a farmer. As anyone who's experienced a farm knows, it takes a lot of strength to be a farmer. He spent the winter of 1859 to 1860 in the South for his health, so he was having trouble just with winter. He decided to go into the dairy wholesale business, selling butter and cheese from Cornwall farms to New York retailers. He set up an office on Washington Street in 1863, relocating to Pearl Street a few years later to be close to the produce exchange. His brother Burton Hart financed the venture, which grew rapidly, and the firm eventually included branches in Manhattan, Wisconsin, and Liverpool, England. By 1877, Hart's dairy wholesale business had annual sales of over $2 million, which in 1877 is a lot of money. And it's a lot of money today, but in 1877, that's a fortune. He joined the board of directors of the New York Produce Exchange Insurance Company, as well as city railway companies, and was a trustee of the U.S. Savings Bank, all of which was built on Cornwall's dairy industry. That's how, that's basically, here you have someone who grows up on the Cornwall farm, doesn't want to do the farming, and becomes probably a millionaire by starting out selling Cornwall products in New York. Down in Bridgeport, Noah Rogers set up his mercantile ventures after shipping butter in partnership with farmer Sheldon Clark from the Cornwall Bridge station. Rogers actually worked at Pratt Foster, taking over as manager of produce and becoming a partner after 2 years. In 1875, he set up shop in Bridgeport, opening a wholesale butter, cheese, grocer, and commission business. He specialized in butter and cheese, using his connections to Cornwall farmers. The company was renamed Rogers and Warford in 1881 and developed a reputation for reliability and professionalism. At least some of the dairy products he sold in Bridgeport, if not a large portion of them, came from his farm, as well as the farms of his neighbors and extended family in Cornwall. When people have come to the exhibit, when they've looked at some of the things, one of the reactions I get is, well, what's Bridgeport doing in our exhibit in Cornwall? Well, this is why. Cornwall was in Bridgeport, and Bridgeport was a major source of revenue for Cornwall farmers. This is the Bridgeport train station. So the train leaves Cornwall and eventually ends up here in Bridgeport. You've got the cart waiting to unload. Across the street is the Atlantic Hotel, which is where Noah Rogers stayed sometimes during his early years of his Bridgeport venture. The hotel conveniently located right at the train station. Rogers also started the Rogers Dairy retail store in Bridgeport, selling pure milk, which was a very specially designated term, and cream, with the motto, purity and cleanliness. His son took over the management of the dairy farm. William Rogers spent his childhood on the farm of his maternal grandparents, Samuel and Martha Scoville, here in Cornwall, before moving to Bridgeport to help with his father's business ventures. Another son, Noah Rogers Jr., also went into the dairy retail business in Bridgeport. This is a milk cooler patent from 1869. Keeping milk cool was vital to keeping it fresh and safe to drink. This patent was granted to John Cotton Sherwood, who grew up in West Cornwall, attended the Cream Hill Agricultural School, and then went off to college. When he was done with college, he worked as a clerk and merchant in West Cornwall for 7 years before starting his own milk and produce business in Washington, Connecticut. His milk cooler was patented while he was working in West Cornwall and helped cool the milk as it came out of the cow, spreading the liquid in a thin layer over a cooling plate. The patent model, a metal pail with a sloping tray, was actually sold at auction in 2002. I don't know who bought it. I don't know where it is. I just know it's out there somewhere. I'd love to see it. I'd love to add it to our collection. Ice. This is ice harvesting on the Housatonic River. Ice was an important part of dairy farming before the advent of electric refrigeration and continued until the early 1900s. Farmers would cut blocks of ice from rivers, ponds, and lakes in the winter months, storing the ice for use in the warmer months of the year. Ice was beneficial for storing and shipping dairy products, as well as for keeping butter firm during production. Gathering ice on Cream Hill Lake. In January 1869, to give an example of how much ice we're talking about, West Cornwall farmers cut and stored an estimated 300 tons of ice for the upcoming season. Ice houses were built close to their sources of ice. So here is an ice house on Lake Road, close to Cream Hill Lake. You may recognize this as Tim Prentice's studio now. Having a small ice house attached to your dairy was sort of how it started. It was considered useful for storing your butter. I mean, remembering, at first it was all about butter and cheese. With the growth of the milk industry, ice houses became essential for keeping the milk from spoiling before it reached the market. And this is a diagram, this is also in the exhibit, of a typical ice house from 1898, illustrated in a magazine called Ice and Refrigeration. Silos. The introduction of the silo and warm winter stables increased winter milk production. Once there was a market for milk, the farmers really started looking on increasing their production, maximizing their profits. So instead of just saying, okay, well, it's winter, lean times, we're not going to get that much milk out of our cows, it converted to how much milk can we get out of our cows. Silos kept the cows fed throughout the winter, reducing the need for pasture land. Again, it was all about economizing and maximizing profits. The first silo in the United States was built in Michigan in 1875. By 1882, there were, according to some of the records I found, I don't know how accurate it is, but by 1882, there were nearly 100 silos in the entire United States, including several in Cornwall and the surrounding towns. So we were ahead of the curve there. But again, remember, Cornwall was the major supplier of milk on the Housatonic Railroad line. I mean, this was big business in Cornwall. Chopping corn for silage. Silos would be filled with grass or corn, which would be fed through a machine that chopped it up and then blew it up through a long tube to the top of the silo. And as with every job on the farm, it was very hard work. During the late 1800s and the early 1900s, dairy farming flourished in Cornwall. This is the Cream Hill Farm, T.S. Gold standing with one of his apples. Cream Hill Farm was not just dairy, it was also apples for many, many years. Dozens of families worked dairy farms in every part of Cornwall, despite ever-increasing challenges and frustrations. This is the Clark family, which had Mohawk Farm. In 1910, the census recorded more than 125 Cornwall residents, which, at the time, was about 12% of the town's population. So in 1910, 12% of the town's population was listed in the census as being employed in the dairy industry. Bearing in mind, that's only the men. That's only the heads of the household, the men who were owners of the farm or who were laborers on the farm. It does not include the wives, which any woman who's been married to a dairy farmer will tell you she's doing plenty of work on the farm. It also doesn't include the children, which we know is another misleader there, because the kids help out with all of the farm chores as soon as they are old enough. So probably, we're looking at maybe a third of the town, maybe even more than a third of the town, if you count everyone who was involved with the farm, is working a dairy farm in 1910. This is a shot from the Hart farm. In 1920, things changed, and most of Cornwall's dairy farms switched over to being general farms, diversifying their operations. This was not just happening in Cornwall, it was happening everywhere. All of the experts in agriculture were saying that the only future was in a diversified farm. Specializing in one product was not going to continue to be economically feasible. Dairy remained important. In 1925, there were 842 milk cows in Cornwall, producing 450,000 gallons of milk each year. This is the Sandmeyer cattle. In 1930, there are only 46 farms in Cornwall, down from 148 farms 60 years later. So in 60 years, we go from 148 farms in Cornwall to 46 farms. Of those 46 farms in 1930, only 24 are dairy farms. It was becoming just increasingly difficult to survive as a dairy farmer. And again, it's not just Cornwall, it's everywhere. In 1955, the Connecticut Milk for Health organization was established by the Wholesale Milk Producers Council in Connecticut with the authorization of the General Assembly. The group sought to increase sales of milk through statewide advertising. Funding came from farmers who agreed to have a fee deducted from the price of all milk sold. Advertisements began running in 1958, appearing in newspapers, on billboards, radio, and television. The campaign continued until the 1970s, and it really was part of a nationwide effort to get people to drink milk. So basically what we have is we start out with an industry that's all about butter and cheese.
Don't do that again.
Sorry. Butter? So we start out with an industry that's all about butter and cheese, and then milk becomes the big product, and everyone puts all of their money into milk, and they put all of their facilities into milk.
I'm sorry.
That was Jeff that time.
Is that really mic on? You don't need that on the mic. Is that the problem? Is that mic on? You're looking at?
Try it once more.
Okay. So they transition from butter and cheese to milk, and then people just basically don't drink as much milk. Soda becomes cheaper than milk, as you probably noticed, and milk. We have so many people, so much of an industry dependent on a product that isn't as feasible as it used to be. Today, there's only one commercial dairy operation left in Cornwall, Stonewall Dairy. Those are their cows on Route 7. And the decline of the dairy industry, it's important to remember, this isn't just a Cornwall story. The number of dairy farms in Connecticut dropped from 357 in 1989 to 192 in 2002. I believe we're down to about 140 now. The majority of Connecticut's dairy farms are located east of the Connecticut River. And nationwide, it's the same trend. In 1992, there were 131,000 dairy farms in the United States. In 2011, 51,000. So this is a national phenomenon where dairy farms are disappearing everywhere. There are a lot of different reasons for that, which I'm not going to get into today. And in fact, I encourage you, if you're interested in knowing what's going on today, to come to our program on September 20th, Milk Money, where the author of a book called Milk Money will be here to talk about cash, cows, and the death of the American dairy farm. And Chris Hopkins from our last operational commercial dairy will also be here to talk about his experiences as a dairy farmer today. If you haven't had a chance to visit the exhibit yet, we're going to be going there now. It's about a 3-minute walk down the street, or of course you can drive. We are really grateful to everyone who has contributed to this exhibit. It is very much a community loan exhibit. We've borrowed some really fabulous objects and images from community members, family photos, farming artifacts. It's really, really wonderful. More than a dozen dairy farms are included in the exhibit, including the Scoville Farm, which is this one. This is 2006, right before they ended their dairy operation. And it's important, this is something that I have said over and over, and here's the, looks better in color, looks better in real life. This exhibit is really a starting point for the Historical Society. One of the challenges I faced with this exhibit is that the history hadn't been written yet. The Civil War exhibit last year was pretty straightforward. There's been a lot written about the Civil War. There was actually a fair amount written about Cornwall's experiences in the Civil War. But the history of Cornwall's dairy farming in the 20th century, nothing. I had to go to all the primary sources to pull the story together. But it was such an important part of this town's history for such a long time. We really need to build our collection. So we're asking all of you to spread the word. If someone has objects or images or stories about Cornwall's dairy farms, we want to know about it. We'd like to be able to build our collections. If someone has photographs they don't want to give to us, that's fine. We'd love a chance to make copies for our archives so that we preserve this history, because that is what we are all about. We're also doing oral histories. So if you know someone who has some fantastic memories about Cornwall's farms, and wouldn't mind if we send someone in with a tape recorder to get them talking and to record and to preserve those memories for posterity, please let us know. You can reach us by our email address. You can call us on the phone. You can bump into one of our board members and tell them in person about this, and they should be able to pass the word on to me. So, you know, this is an ongoing project. This is an important part of Cornwall, and we want to make sure that we're able to keep telling the story for years to come. So with that, the next thing that we'll be doing, as I said, is strolling down the street. We have beverages and snacks and air conditioning waiting for you, as well as the exhibit itself. Yes?
Is there any central cheese place, or is the cheese being made individually by each farmer?
From what I can tell, each farmer was making the cheese themselves. There were creameries, however, that were established. There's a creamery in the exhibit that was a sort of a centralized location for 3 farms that worked together to produce their butter and presumably cheese as well. Yes.
When was homogenized? When did milk become homogenized?
Homogenization, the specific date is in the exhibit, but it's a mid-20th century transition where you start seeing the homogenization. And unlike pasteurization, there wasn't a health reason for it. It was something that simply perhaps was a convenience issue. You don't have to shake it up before you drink it. You also see, of course, later in the 20th century, people being concerned about the fat content of milk and switching to low-fat or no-fat milk.
I remember getting milk with bottle tops that said from tuberculin-tested cows.
Yes.
I mean, raw milk.
Yeah.
I think it was raw milk, but the cows have been tested to be safe.
The farmers basically were, I think initially it was a pressure issue, but we have a couple of tuberculin certificates in the exhibit, and it was something that was an annual test that the farmers had to pass, that their cows were free from tuberculosis, which of course could get passed on to the consumer.
I think the Calhouns have tuberculin tested.
Yep.
And
Yes.
when did the railroad cars begin to be refrigerated?
I don't know off the top of my head. That's going to be turn of the century.
But they knew they had to keep the milk cold.
Right.
Prior to that.
Right.
So that must have been.
That's why they
that was
introduced-
the challenge.
Yeah, they introduced the milk train, so it's at least the cooler, not in the hottest part of the day. But it was, just sort of things things progress and new technologies advance. But I don't have the specific date for the refrigeration.
Do you have a butter box, an original butter box with original papers of the separation of the butter pads?
No.
I will donate one.
Wonderful. Thank you.
What kind of, any notions of what kind of income is being going on in it? Or this,
I think that in the 1870s, the big farms were prosperous. I think that farmers were able to generate an income that was very comfortable. Once you get into the 20th century, I don't know how, a lot of farmers simply could not survive. There was no income. You get into the 20th century and you have farmers talking about how they don't pay any income tax because they never have any income. Even relatively early in the 20th century, even into the 1920s, 1930s, of course, the Depression, but before the Depression, farmers are subsistence farmers. They are making some money, obviously, off the dairy farming, or they wouldn't keep doing it, but they're surviving on their own vegetables, they're surviving on their own meat. It was you can sit back from the comfort of the 21st century, curator, the museum field is not, a huge income generator, but It's a lot easier than being a farmer. It's a lot more prosperous than being a farmer. I look at it and say, you have to love it. It has to be something that you really love to do, because economically it doesn't make sense. Other questions before we stroll down the street, Gail?
Where's all the milk coming from now that's in New York City? I mean, is it just factory farming, or is the farms bigger, or?
Do you want me to say something?
I don't know. New York specifically, I don't know. Obviously there are still milk producers in Connecticut. They usually work together as co-ops or conglomerates, which was the transition that happened in the 20th century, where the farmers fill up the tank O milk and ship it off to the dairy, which then pasteurizes it, homogenizes it, and cartons it for the consumer. Wisconsin and California.
I guess the whole country was.
Right. Yeah. The biggest place. California actually has its own regulations, separate from everyone else's regulations. Initially, because they were so far away from the rest of the country, but they still actually have their own separate regulations. But the farmers are all moving around. This is the other thing that you're seeing is that right now. The transition is that the dairy farmers in California are looking to leave California because there's not enough water. You have the Connecticut farmers who went to Utah. It's a mobile and difficult industry. Yes.
I just heard on NPR yesterday something about dairy farms in New York State, and their production is up and they're dumping milk because demand is down, and in Vermont. So I'm thinking that probably New York State has quite a relatively big dairy industry, and they're producing too much milk.
Yeah, and in fact, New York State was the big competition for Connecticut early on. Before things west of the Mississippi were settled, in the late 1800s, I would come across, the 1870s, I'd come across references to competition from the West, which was New York State.
I just read in the paper today that Freud's farm in East Canaan,
Yes, the robots,
is going to start their milking with robots.
Yes. Milking. Yes, I read that this morning. That this is, and the trends in dairy farming, it goes from environmental regulations where they're trying to figure out how to get cows to stop farting so much, basically. That cows produce too much methane and it's bad for the environment, to robot labor.
You mentioned a lot of stuff about the pounds of cheese that were leaving Cornwall, the pounds of milk, but back in the 1800s, how much feed and how much water did it take to produce a gallon of milk? What were the dominant breeds of cows? And how did that increase in the coming years?
I think all of that is in the exhibit. I think I do actually have a copy of an article that talks about how much feed and so forth. When you start seeing things like the Cream Hill Agricultural School, you start seeing scientific approaches to farming where the farmers are recording exactly those figures. How much feed does it take? How much water does it take? What type of feed gets the best milk, either for quantity or quality? And you see a transition. The first cows in Cornwall were Devons, just like the ones that are down the street in the valley. Shorthorns were big in Connecticut in the 1700s. And then you start seeing other breeds coming in. And then the switch over to the Holsteins, because they could produce the most milk. It was about how much milk you could get out of it. A farm like Stonewall Dairy has Jerseys because it's a richer quality. Stonewall Dairy is not looking at how much milk we can produce, but producing smaller quantities of creamier, richer milk. So it's, there's a lot of factors, and it's we've got a couple of the record books. The other article in the paper today was about the heifer at Arethusa that sold for $105,000 at auction. You know, it's certain. You know, they track how much milk each cow is producing, and if you have a cow that's a big milk producer, she's going to be genetically exciting because presumably her offspring will also be big milk producers. It's the same thing as with horse racing, where you've got a really fast horse, so its offspring are more valuable because they might be really fast too.
I mean, the basic change has been in 1970, there were plenty of farms around here with from 40 to 70 cows getting milk. And that was a family farm. And that's now the costs, and the size has grown up now. So you look at chapters where they're milking, I guess, over 1,000 cows 3 times a day. I mean, the whole family works there, but it's not a family farm.
Right.
And so our landscape and the business model of the family farm has just been pushed aside.
Yeah.
It doesn't work anymore in Connecticut.
Yep. All right. One last question, and then we'll walk down the street.
Can you explain the impact of regulating milk prices and how that affected the small dairy farmers?
That started in the late 1800s because okay, I don't have an economics degree. But it's a supply and demand issue. So when milk became in demand, farmers would start producing X amount of milk to meet the demand. When demand changed, they had to figure out how to keep their prices up. And there were a lot of farmers who would start overproducing, which would cause the prices to drop further. Because they were oversaturating the market with milk, and if anyone's an economics person, feel free to jump in. When you oversaturate the market, the price goes down, and so it's actually started with things like the Milk Producers Organization saying, we know you're tempted to do things a certain way, but the economics prove that that's a mistake, and so that's when they started introducing regulations about both pricing as well as quantities of production to try to keep the market stable. Now, unfortunately, as with a lot of industries in this country, the federal regulations work for the mega farms. The farms in Wisconsin and California with thousands and thousands and thousands of head of cattle are fine with a lot of these regulations. They can afford these things. The small farmers can't. There have been a lot of times when the price of milk gets fixed at a point where it is below the minimum needed to just, you know, not even make a profit, but just to cover your costs. And that's what puts the small farmers out of business, because they cannot compete with those mega farms out west. So buy local. Thank you.
Nicely done, as always. I apologize for the microphone issues. We'll turn that over to our technical department. Whoever that might be, we'll try to work that out. Listen, one quick thing we were talking about, there only being one dairy farm left in Cornwall. That, of course, is Chris Hopkins' place down here on Route 7. And the only way that Chris manages to make things work is that he's very clever marketing-wise. And, of course, he's come up with a unique product. Because all he sells is whole milk. And it's raw milk, rather. And it's interesting talking to him about who his customers are, because an awful lot of Eastern European families, Russians, South American families who drive up from southern Connecticut to buy their raw milk at his place. So it's a very, very clever marketing operation, and because of the way that it's run, he doesn't need to have federal inspectors. because he doesn't sell out of state, he doesn't sell to any co-ops. So in order to survive as the last remaining Cornwall dairy, he has to be a very, very clever man. And anyway, what?
Oh, yes.
Oh, yes,
Sign.
please make certain you've signed in the registration book and stroll down the street, and we have some goodies and cold things to drink for you. Thank you.